podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and before I forget, for like the fourth month in a row, like 16 weeks, I have forgotten to make this announcement. The show's on YouTube now. Granted, I don't have the budget, nor the time, nor the energy, nor the desire, nor the face to video all of this, but the audio is on YouTube. So if you do anything through YouTube and you want to consume the show there now, you can absolutely do that. Just a small thing, very inconsequential, but I've been meaning to say that for several weeks now, and I keep forgetting. So today we're talking about some more airplane stories. If you remember the last time we did this, I don't know which episode it was. I'll figure it out later on and tell you. We talked about mostly some airplane crashes or people who got sucked out of airplanes. And I'm telling you right now, it's going to be a lot of the same today. So, get ready. We got 4 stories of some more airplane mishaps right now.
Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time.
We start on the evening of January 5th, 1960, when a Boeing 707 was preparing to leave Idlewild Airport, now known as JFK International Airport in New York, on its flight to Miami, Florida. However, a pre-flight inspection uncovered cracks in the cockpit windshield, so they had to ground that plane. They couldn't take it off. So instead, passengers were taken off of that Boeing and were put on 2 separate propeller aircraft that the airport had in reserve. The first plane departed with 76 passengers, landed safely in Miami without any problems. But based on them being in this episode, guess what happened to the second flight with the remaining 29 passengers? Well, at about 7 a.m. the next morning, farmer Richard Randolph phoned to the airport in Wilmington, North Carolina, to notify authorities that a plane had crashed in one of his fields near the town of Bolivia overnight. Bolivia, one of those kind of small towns along US 17 between Wilmington and Myrtle Beach. All but one of the bodies was recovered from that crash site. The other body that they didn't find belonged to passenger Julian Frank, who was finally discovered on the beach about 16 miles away. Now, Frank's body and his backstory raised a lot of questions to FBI investigators. For starters, his injuries were significantly different and way worse from others in the crash, which is pretty remarkable considering everyone fell out of the sky and the other 75 people presumably hit the ground at a very high rate of speed and then blew up. But somehow Julian Frank was in worse shape. His legs had been ripped off of his body and all kinds of debris was embedded in him, including small pieces of wire and nitrate battery residue that were removed during the autopsy. Well, back in New York, Julian Frank had been accused of running a charity scam and was actually under investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office at the time of the crash. He was covered by nearly $900,000 in life insurance policies, including some that he had purchased before he left New York that morning. And $900,000 in life insurance in 1960 is wild. And it was also like, granted, like he probably bought a lot of that at the airport that morning because that's just how real life was back then. You could just buy life insurance for yourself in the airports before you took off because everyone was just like, yeah, this is still pretty risky. We have no idea if any of this is ever going to work. And so you could just buy life insurance for yourself and then presumably, cancel that policy, once you landed or whatever. I don't know how all that worked out. But despite all of this suspicious behavior, investigators concluded that Frank was just really unlucky. Like, he had nothing to do with this. Instead, a dynamite charge had been detonated on the plane, which, if you recall, was already a substitute plane from the one that, Frank and everybody else were originally going to be on. And the dynamite had been detonated very close to where Frank was sitting. Despite that, investigators do not believe Frank intentionally detonated the charge, because he would have had no idea that he was going to get moved to a substitute plane unless he then sabotaged the first plane in order to get to the second plane. But then why wouldn't he have just blown up the first plane? No one knows. No one really thinks that Julian Frank had anything to do with it. No one knows how that dynamite charge got attached to that second reserve plane, and the case has remained unsolved. Moving on here to October 20th, 1986, when pilot Alexander Kliuyev began his descent of Aeroflot Flight 6502 into the Kurmak airport in the city of Samara, Russia. Because he had landed planes hundreds of times, he had tons of flight hours, he was pretty bored. And he decided to make a bet with his co-pilot, Gennady Zhimov. And the bet was that he could just pull the curtain over the cockpit windows and land the plane using only the primitive instruments laid out in front of him. Air traffic control, who was aware of this bet, was not exactly happy about it, and they tried to compromise with Alexander and begged him to, at least, if you're gonna, block the the front windshield and not be able to see, at least link to the beacons on the ground for some additional assistance. But Alexander refused. All right. He's like, I fly many plane, even terrible, crappy Russia plane. I can land plane with only few instrument. I really good. Well, guess what, guys? Seeing that Alexander was coming in too low and way too fast for a safe landing, air traffic control then asked Alexander to abort the landing and try again. But Alexander, he's like, no, I have under control. I fly fast and low. That's how I live life. Very low, very fast. A few seconds later, shockingly, the plane smacked the ground, flipped over, split in half, burst into flames, and then came to a rest upside down, killing 70 of the 94 people on board. On the bright side, 14 children were on the plane, and they all survived. Zhimov, possibly happy that he had won the bet, quickly began trying to save the surviving passengers before he suffered a heart attack and died. Alexander, who also survived, was sentenced to 10 years in prison, probably for just being incredibly stupid. After an additional investigation discovered that alcohol wasn't actually even remotely a factor in the crash, because that would be the only logical reason to make such a stupid bet, the sentence was then extended for another 5 years. Our next story, moving pretty quickly. On April 7th, 1994, a FedEx plane departed from Memphis for a normal cargo flight to San Jose, California. In addition to the flight crew, a guy named Auburn Calloway boarded the plane. And Calloway worked as a FedEx pilot and was allowed to join the flight as a passenger, since company policy allowed for any employee to ride the planes for free if there was room. But rather than bringing a backpack or a small suitcase to get to California for whatever he was going to do, Calloway only brought a guitar case. That was apparently not suspicious to anyone. Well, once the plane was at cruising altitude, Calloway opened up the guitar case and pulled out 2 claw hammers and 2 club hammers, both of which very heavy, very metal, very much ouchies. If you get hit by them. He then walked up behind flight engineer Andre Peterson and smashed his head before then going to co-pilot James Tucker and doing the same. By that point, pilot David Sanders was very aware that his crew was getting attacked and then wrestled with Calloway to try to get control of those hammers that he was wielding. After a brief struggle, Calloway ran back to his guitar case and pulled out a spear gun. How? Why? Why does anyone, first of all, why does anyone in Memphis, Tennessee own a spear gun? Like, honestly, only people who maybe live on the coast who do spear fishing probably should own a spear gun. And even then, find a different hobby. Anyway, He pulled out a spear gun. Peterson, who by now he has a fractured skull and a slashed artery from this fight, pulled himself off the ground and lunged at Calloway. And within minutes, the flight engineer, comes back to. All right. He rejoins the fight while co-pilot, what's his face? James Tucker. He also comes back to, pulls himself together enough to take over the controls of the plane, which by now this plane's flying with nothing, like not even autopilot. And so it's just going all willy-nilly through the sky. As the men fought, co-pilot Tucker, he gets this bright idea to point the aircraft straight up into the air before then banking the plane 140 degrees, which was almost entirely upside down. Like he was Denzel Washington in Flight, if you've ever seen that movie, which you probably haven't. Tucker, with pieces of his own skull lodged in his brain, then put the plane through several more maneuvers that it probably wasn't well equipped to handle with a full cargo load, which caused Calloway and the other crew members that were all fighting each other to fly around the fuselage, bounce off the walls and all the cargo. Eventually, Calloway lost control of his spear gun, allowing Peterson and Sanders to subdue him. Within minutes, the plane then made an emergency landing and police were able to arrest Calloway. After a brief investigation, police learned that Calloway was just trying to kill himself and paint the crash as an accident to get a life insurance payment because he was on the verge of being fired by FedEx for altering his working hours. He thought that by taking the crew hostage and forcing them to fly around long enough for the black box to loop over its data before crashing would work just fine, rather than, I don't know, literally any other better way to kill himself. Instead, he received 20 years to life in prison. Our final story here, going to be a shorter episode this week, but whatever. Again, it's a free show. Go listen to some more stuff, but don't leave forever. This is one of my favorite stories, possibly ever. On July 6th, 2013, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 took off from Incheon International Airport in South Korea on its way to San Francisco, California. It's an overnight flight. The next day, the flight prepared for its landing. Everything seemed fine. Even the weather was perfect, which San Francisco, not necessarily known for great flying weather, and that airport known as being one of the hardest places to land a plane at. Unfortunately, the plane was flying too low and too slow to execute a safe landing. And just 82 seconds before it was supposed to land, the plane's autopilot turned off and the crew began trying to land the plane manually, which that element of it is pretty normal. However, their speed continued to decrease despite calls for air traffic control for them to increase it. They never were able to. The plane eventually crashed short of the runway's threshold, with the plane's tail and landing gear hitting the seawall that protects the runway from the San Francisco Bay. And if you've ever seen the runway layout for the San Francisco airport, a lot of it just juts out into the water, which is wild. One of the engines and the rest of the tail immediately broke off from the rest of the plane. And then what was left of the fuselage then kind of started to rotate as it slid down the runway, finally coming to a rest about a half mile from where it had initially hit the ground. A minute later, the oil tank on the plane ruptured, sending oil to the hot engine and igniting a huge fire. At the same time, the plane's evacuation slides deployed, allowing many of the plane's passengers to walk out under their own power. All but 3 people survived. So, for the most part, not a giant tragedy. But that's not the end of the story. For starters, one of the people who died, 16-year-old Yi Meng-wan, was killed by the rescue team trying to race out there to help everyone in the crash. She had initially survived the first impact, and then she had even survived actually getting thrown out of the plane when kind of the tailpiece ripped off and like exposed the back end of the fuselage, and she got actually ripped out of the plane, and she survived that. But she did not survive the fire truck that was speeding along down the runway to catch up to the plane to spray foam onto the wreckage. This poor girl got run over. Which, how do you do that in a fire truck? Like, runways are huge. All right. There's plenty of room to maneuver. You just didn't care about running over debris and that debris being a person. Anyway, that's not why this is my favorite part of the story. That's actually kind of sad. And here's the thing. Let's say by some miracle she did survive by getting hit by that fire truck. She absolutely did not survive the second fire truck that came through and ran her over again on its way to get water to douse the flames. To make things worse, her body was described by the fire chief after the fact as if, quote, someone dropped a pumpkin. So she is just splattered and smattered all over the runway. It's very unfortunate. Now, while all of this was going on, while the plane's on fire, while people are evacuating, while the fire truck's running over a passenger to get out there and put the fire out, San Francisco news outlets had already picked up on this story, including Fox affiliate KTVU. Now, during the broadcast, this channel, they broke in with breaking news, plane has crashed on the runway. While they're broadcasting this, they got a hot tip from a passenger who was on the flight and had names of the pilots of the Boeing 777 that they crashed because they couldn't land it properly. And then, because news outlets only care about reporting things first and not so much about reporting things the right way with all of the facts, anchor Tori Campbell broke in, and I'm just going to play what she said.
We have new information now also on the plane crash. KTVU has just learned the names of the 4 pilots who were on board the flight. They are Captain Sum Ting Wong, Wee Tu Lo, Ho Lee Fook, and Bang Ding Ao. The NTSB has confirmed these are the names of the pilots on board Flight 214 when it crashed. We are working to determine exactly what roles each of them played during the landing on Saturday.
Yeah, except there was one giant problem with that, other than like the extreme racism. The NTSB did not actually confirm that, like she said they did. Also, I mean, and I get it, man. If you're a news anchor, you're just on autopilot and you're just reading whatever the prompter says at that point. But like, you gotta wonder, like, okay, maybe Sum Ting Wong. All right, fine. You can get away with that. But then you go to Wee Tu Lo, your brain's gotta something's gotta go off in your brain. Like, something's not right here. And then Ho Lee Fook, come on. And it was spelled right there on the screen, right? It was F-U-K. So like, she's trying to pronounce it all Asian-y, but like, come on. And then Bang Ding Ao, come on. Like, I know Asians got some silly names, but it's just, I mean, one of the greatest pranks ever in the history of pranks. But and this is absolutely what journalism and news, did they learn from this lesson? No, of course not. Journalism still cares more about being first than being right. And we see that with every gigantic, breaking news event that keeps happening. But, oh God, just so great. I love this moment in history so much. The station did quickly realize what had happened, and they fired several staff members who were involved in that, including the producer who was working that breaking news broadcast the next day. There you go. Some more airplane stories in the books. If you wanted to go back to part 1, or, the first edition of this series, it's back on episode 204 from February of this year. But let's recap this episode and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number one, if you're a pilot, don't be making bets with your co-pilot on how well you can land a plane when you've got a bunch of people on board. Don't be playing with lives like that. Now look, if you're just flying with another person by yourself and you want to do that, go for it. All right. You two can just be idiots together, but don't. Yeah. Anyway, number two, if you're a fire truck driver, don't just run over whatever debris on the road. Like, especially if you're on a runway, like you can move out of the way. All right. Fire trucks, they're probably not the most nimble driving machines, but I mean, come on. I can't imagine you couldn't see that pile of something out on the runway, even if you didn't know it was a person, and you could have swerved out of the way or not even swerve. You didn't even have to swerve. You could just go a little bit over to the side, just a little bit, and get around it. Anyway, and then number three, journalists. Verify your sources, and maybe don't because here's the thing. Why does it matter what the names of the pilots were? That's the thing that gets me, right? Is like, oh, we got these juicy details and we're going to be the first to report them. But are those details really important? Who cares what the names of the pilots were on that plane that crashed? It's not like, it's not like the pilots were Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. That would have been an interesting, okay, at that point, yes, that is an interesting bit of information to tell us about a plane that had crashed. You mean to tell me that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone piloted a plane from South Korea to San Francisco and then they crashed it on landing? That is quite interesting. Thank you. But then just some four random Asian dudes? Who cares? There's a ton of Asians. Why should we care about the names of the four Asian pilots? It's so stupid. So I don't know, journalists, maybe filter some stuff out a little better.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, it's gonna be another shorter episode, but we're gonna be talking about some weird weapons from history. Sometimes pretty early on, a couple hundred years ago, at least, where people got together and they came up with some unique solutions for some problems and made some crazy weapons that were way more destructive than they expected them to be, and calamity ensued. We're going to talk about the Hell Burner, the Dardanelles operation, and the Peacemaker, which it's an ironic name if you couldn't already tell. So come back next week for that. Thank you for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
This is a podcast